Vasilisa the Beautiful and Baba Yaga. Many years ago, in a certain tsardom, across 3 times 9 kingdoms, beyond high mountain chains, there once lived a merchant. He had been married for 12 years, but in that time there had been born to him only one child, a daughter, who from her cradle was called Vasilisa the Beautiful. When the little girl was 8 years old, her mother fell ill, and before many days it was plain to be seen that she must die. So she called her little daughter to her, took a tiny wooden doll from under the blanket of the bed, put it into the hands of her child, and said, "My little Vasilisa, my dear daughter, listen to what I say, remember well my last words, and fail not to carry out my wishes. I am dying, and with my blessing I leave to thee this little doll. It is very precious, for there is no other like it in the whole world. Carry it always about with thee in thy pocket, and never show it to anyone. When evil threatens thee or sorrow befalls thee, go into a corner, take the doll from thy pocket, and give it something to eat and drink. It will eat and drink a little, and then thou mayest tell it thy trouble and ask its advice, and it will tell thee how to act in thy time of need." So saying, she kissed her little daughter on the forehead, blessed her, and shortly afterwards died. Little Vasilisa grieved greatly for her mother, and her sorrow was so deep that when the dark night came, she lay in her bed and wept and did not sleep. At length she bethought herself of the tiny doll, so she rose and took it from the pocket of her gown, and finding a piece of wheat bread and a cup of kvass, she set them before it, and said, "There, my little doll, take it, eat a little, and drink a little, and listen to my grief. My dear mother is dead, and I am lonely for her." Then the doll's eyes began to shine like fireflies, and suddenly it became alive. It ate a morsel of the bread and took a sip of the kvass, and when it had eaten and drank, it said, "Don't weep, little Vasilisa. Grief is worst at night. Lie down, shut thine eyes, comfort thyself, and go to sleep. The morning is wiser than the evening." So Vasilisa the Beautiful lay down, comforted herself, and went to sleep. And the next day her grieving was not so deep, and her tears were less bitter. Now, after the death of his wife, the merchant sorrowed for many days, as was right. But at the end of that time he began to desire to marry again, and he started to look about for a suitable wife. This was not difficult, for he had a fine house with a stable of swift horses, besides being a good man, who gave much to the poor. Of all the women he saw, however, the one who to his mind suited him best of all was a widow of about his own age, with 2 daughters of her own, and she, he thought, besides being a good housekeeper, would be a kind foster mother to his little Vasilisa. So the merchant married the widow, and brought her home as his wife. But the little girl soon found that her foster mother was very far from being what her father had thought. She was a cold, cruel woman who had desired the merchant for the sake of his wealth, and she had no love for his daughter. Vasilisa was the greatest beauty in the whole village, while the daughters of the foster mother were as spare and homely as 2 crows, And because of this, all three envied and hated Vasilisa. They gave her all sorts of errands to run and difficult tasks to perform, in order that the toil might make her thin and worn, and that her face might grow brown from sun and wind. And they treated her so cruelly as to leave few joys in her life for her. But little Vasilisa endured all this without complaint, and while the stepmother's two daughters grew always thinner and uglier in spite of the fact that they had no hard tasks to do at all, and never went out in cold or rain, and sat always with their arms folded like ladies at court. Despite all this, she herself had cheeks like blood and milk, and grew every day more and more beautiful. Now, the reason for this was the tiny doll, without whose help little Vasilisa could never have managed to do all the work that was laid upon her. Each night, when everyone else was sound asleep, she would get up from her bed, take the doll into a closet, and, locking the door, give the doll something to eat and drink, and say, "There, my little doll, take it, eat a little, drink a little, and listen to my grief. I live in my father's house, but my spiteful stepmother wishes to drive me out into the white world. Tell me, how shall I act, and what shall I do?" The little doll's eyes would begin to shine like glowworms, and it would become alive. It would eat a little food and sip a little drink, and then it would comfort her and tell her how to act. While Vasilisa slept, it would get ready all her work for the next day, so that she had only to rest in the shade and gather flowers, for the doll would have the kitchen garden weeded, and the beds of cabbages watered, and plenty of fresh water brought from the well, and the stoves heated exactly right. And besides this, the little doll told her how to make, from a certain herb, an ointment which prevented her from ever being sunburnt. So all the joy in life that came to Vasilisa came to her through the tiny doll that she always carried in her pocket. Years passed, till Vasilisa grew up and became of an age when it is good to marry. All the young men in the village, high and low, rich and poor, asked for her hand, while not one of them stopped even to look at the stepmother's two daughters, so ill-favored were they. This angered their mother even more against Vasilisa. She answered every gallant who came with the same words, "Never shall the younger be wed before the older ones." And each time when she had let a suitor out of the door, she would soothe her anger and hatred by beating her stepdaughter. So, while Vasilisa grew each day more lovely and graceful, she was often miserable, and but for the little doll in her pocket, she would have longed to leave the white world. Now there came a time when it became necessary for the merchant to leave his home and travel to a distant tsardom. He bade farewell to his wife and her two daughters, kissed Vasilisa and gave her his blessing, and departed, bidding them to say a prayer each day for his safe return. Scarcely was he out of sight of the village, however, when his wife sold his house, packed all his goods, and moved with them to another dwelling far from town, in a gloomy neighborhood on the edge of a wild forest. Here every day, while her two daughters were working indoors, the merchant's wife would send Vasilisa on one errand or another into the forest, either to find a branch of a certain rare bush, or to bring her flowers or berries. Now, deep in this forest, as the stepmother very well knew, there was a green lawn, and on the lawn stood a little hut on hen's legs, where lived a certain Baba Yaga, an old witch grandmother. Baba Yaga lived alone, and no one dared go near the hut, for she ate people as one eats chickens. The merchant's wife sent Vasilisa into the forest each day, hoping she might meet the old witch and be devoured. But always the girl came home safe and sound, because the little doll showed her where the bush, the flowers, and the berries grew, and the little doll did not let her go near the hut that stood on hen's legs. And each time the stepmother hated her more and more, because she came to no harm. One autumn evening, the merchant's wife called the 3 girls to her and gave them each a task. One of her daughters she bade make a piece of lace, the other to knit a pair of hose, and to Vasilisa she gave a basket of flax to be spun. She bade each to finish a certain amount. Then she put out all the fires in the house, leaving only a single candle lighted in the room where the 3 girls worked, and she herself went to sleep. They worked an hour, they worked 2 hours, they worked 3 hours, when one of the elder daughters took up the tongs to straighten the wick of the candle. She pretended to do this awkwardly, as her mother had told her to do, and she put the candle out as if by accident. "What are we to do now?" asked her sister. "The fires are all out. There is no other light in the house, and our tasks are not done." "We must go fetch fire," said the first. "The only house near is a hut in the forest where a Baba Yaga lives. One of us must go and borrow fire from her." "I have enough light from my steel pins," said the one who was making lace, "and I will not go." "Oh, and I have plenty of light from my silver needles," said the other who was knitting the hose, "and I will not go." "Vasilisa," they both said, "go and fetch the fire, for thou hast neither steel pins nor silver needles, and cannot see to spin thy flax." They both rose up and pushed Vasilisa out of the house, and they locked the door, and they cried out, "Thou shalt not come in till thou hast fetched the fire." Vasilisa sat down on the doorstep, took the tiny doll from one pocket, and from another the supper she had ready for it, put the food before the doll, and said, "There, my little doll, take it, eat a little, and listen to my sorrow. I must go to the hut of the old Baba Yaga in the dark forest to borrow some fire, and I fear she will eat me. Tell me, what shall I do?" Then the doll's eyes began to shine like 2 stars, and it became alive. It ate a little, and said, "Do not fear, little Vasilisa. Go where thou hast been sent. While I am with thee, no harm shall come to thee from the old witch." So Vasilisa put the little doll back into her pocket, crossed herself, and started out into the dark, wild forest. Whether she walked a short way or a long way, the telling is easy, but the journey was hard. The wood was very dark, and she could not help trembling from fear. Suddenly she heard the sound of a horse's hoofs, and a man on horseback galloped past her. He was dressed all in white, and the horse under him was milk white, and the harness was white, and just as he passed her, it became twilight. She went a little farther, and again she heard the sound of a horse's hoofs, and there came another man on horseback, galloping past her. He was dressed all in red, and the horse under him was blood red, and its harness was red. And just as he passed her, the sun rose. The whole day Vasilisa walked, for she had lost her way. She could find no path at all in the dark wood, and she had no food to set before the little doll to make it alive. But at evening she came all at once to the green lawn, where the wretched little hut stood on hen's legs. The wall around the hut was made of human bones, and on its top were skulls. There was a gate in the wall whose hinges were the bones of human feet, and whose locks were jawbones set with sharp teeth. The sight filled Vasilisa with horror, and she stopped as still as a post buried in the ground. As she stood there, a third man on horseback came galloping up. His face was black. He was dressed all in black, and the horse he rode upon was coal black. He galloped up to the gate of the hut and disappeared there as if he had sunk through the ground. And at that moment the night came and the forest grew dark. But it was not dark on the green lawn, for instantly the eyes of all the skulls on the wall were lighted up and shone till the place was as bright as day. Seeing this, Vasilisa trembled with fear, so that she could not run away. Then suddenly the wood became full of a terrible noise. The trees began to groan, the branches to creak, and the dry leaves to rustle, and Baba Yaga came flying through the forest. She was riding in a great iron mortar and driving it with a pestle, and she swept away the trail behind her with a kitchen broom. She rode up to the gate, and stopping, she said, little hut, stand the way thy mother placed thee. Turn thy back to the forest, and thy face to me." And the little hut turned, facing her, and stood still. Then, smelling all around her, she cried, "Foo, foo! I smell the smell of a Russian. Who is here?" Vasilisa, in great fright, came nearer to the old woman, and she bowed very low, and she said, "It is only Vasilisa, grandmother. My stepmother's daughters sent me to thee to borrow some fire." "Well," said the old witch, "I know them. But if I give thee the fire, thou shalt stay with me for some time and do some work to pay for it. If not, thou shalt be eaten for my supper." Then she turned to the gate and shouted, "Ho, ye, my solid locks, unlock! Thou, my stout gate, open!" Instantly the locks unlocked, the gate opened of itself, and Baba Yaga rode in whistling. Vasilisa entered behind her, and immediately the gate shut again, and the locks snapped tight. When they had entered the hut, the old witch threw herself down on the stove, stretched out her bony legs, and said, "Come, fetch and put on the table at once everything that is in the oven, for I am hungry." So Vasilisa ran and lighted the splinter of wood from one of the skulls on the wall, and took the food from the oven and set it before Baba Yaga. There was enough cooked meat for 3 strong men. She brought also from the cellar kvass, honey, beer, and wine, and Baba Yaga ate and drank the whole, leaving the girl only a little bit of cabbage soup, a crust of bread, and a morsel of suckling pig. When her hunger was satisfied, The old witch, growing drowsy, lay down on the stove and said, "Listen to me well, and do what I bid thee. Tomorrow, when I drive away, do thou clean the yard, sweep the floors, and cook my supper. Then take a quarter of the measure of wheat from my storehouse, and pick out of it all the black grains and the wild peas. And mind thou dost all that I have told thee to do. If not, thou shalt be eaten for my supper." Presently Baba Yaga turned toward the wall and began to snore, and Vasilisa knew that she was fast asleep. Then Vasilisa went into the corner and took the tiny doll from her pocket, put before it a bit of bread and a little cabbage soup that she had saved, burst into tears, and said to the doll, "There, my little doll, take it, eat a little, drink a little, and listen to my grief. Here I am in the house of the old witch, and the gate in the wall is locked, and I am afraid. She has given me a difficult task, and if I do not do all that she has told me to do, she will eat me tomorrow. Tell me, what shall I do now?" Then the eyes of the little doll began to shine like two candles. It ate a little of the bread and drank a little of the soup, and said, "Don't be afraid, Vasilisa the Beautiful. Be comforted. Say thy prayers and go to sleep. The morning is wiser than the evening." So Vasilisa trusted the little doll and was comforted. She said her prayers, lay down on the floor, and went fast to sleep. When she awoke the next morning very early, it was still dark. She rose and looked out of the window, and she saw that the eyes of the skulls on the wall were growing dim. As she looked, the man dressed all in white, riding the milk-white horse, galloped swiftly around the corner of the hut, leaped the wall, and disappeared. And as he went past, it became quite light, and the eyes of the skulls flickered and went out. The old witch was in the yard. Now she began to whistle, and the great iron mortar and pestle and the kitchen broom flew out of the hut to her. As she got into the mortar, the man dressed all in red, mounted on the blood-red horse, galloped like the wind around the corner of the hut, leaped the wall, and was gone. And at that moment the sun rose. Then Baba Yaga shouted, "Ho, ye, my solid locks! Unlock, thou, my stout gate, open." The locks unlocked, and the gate opened, and she rode away in the mortar, driving with the pestle and sweeping away the trail behind her with the broom. When Vasilisa found herself all alone, she examined the hut, wondering to find it filled with such an abundance of everything. Then she stood still, remembering all the work that she had been bidden to do, and wondering what to begin first. As she looked, she rubbed her eyes. The yard was already neatly cleaned, and the floors were nicely swept, and the little doll was sitting in the corner of the storehouse, picking the last black grains and wild peas out of the quarter measure of wheat. Vasilisa ran and took the little doll in her arms. "My dearest little doll," she cried, "thou hast saved me from my trouble. Now I have only to cook the Baba Yaga's supper, since all the rest of the tasks are done." "Cook it with God's help," said the doll, "and then rest, and may the cooking of it make you healthy." And so saying, it crept into her pocket and became again only a little wooden doll. So Vasilisa rested all day and was refreshed, and when it grew toward evening, she laid the table for the old witch's supper and sat looking out of the window, waiting for her to come. After a while she heard the sound of horses' hoofs, and the man in black on the coal-black horse galloped up to the wall gate and disappeared like a great dark shadow. And instantly it became quite dark, and the eyes of all the skulls began to glitter and shine. Then all at once the trees of the forest began to creak and groan, and the leaves and the bushes to moan and sigh, and Baba Yaga came riding out of the dark wood in the huge iron mortar, driving with the pestle and sweeping out the trail behind her with the kitchen broom. Vasilisa let her in, and the witch, smelling all around here and there, asked, "Well, hast thou done perfectly all the tasks that I gave thee to do, or am I to eat thee for my supper?" "Be so good as to look for thyself, grandmother," answered Vasilisa. So Baba Yaga went all about the place, tapping with her iron pestle and carefully examining everything. But so well had the little doll done its work that, try as hard as she might, the old witch could not find anything to complain of. There was not a weed left in the yard, nor a speck of dust on the floors, nor a single black grain or wild pea in the wheat. She was greatly angered, but she was obliged to pretend to be pleased. "Well," she said, "thou hast done all well." Then, clapping her hands, she shouted, "Ho, my faithful servants, friends of my heart, haste and grind my wheat." Immediately 3 pairs of hands appeared, seized the measure of wheat, and carried it away. The Baba Yaga sat down to supper, and Vasilisa put before her all the food from the oven, with kvass and honey and beer and wine. The old witch ate it, bones and all, almost to the last morsel, enough food for 4 strong men, and then, growing drowsy, she stretched out her bony legs on the stove and said, "Tomorrow do as thou hast done today, and besides these tasks, take from my storehouse a half measure of poppy seeds, and clean them one by one. Someone has mixed earth with them to do me a mischief and to anger me, and I will have them made perfectly clean." So saying, she turned to the wall and soon began to snore. When she was fast asleep, Vasilisa went into the corner, took the little doll from her pocket, set before it a part of the food that was left, and asked the doll for advice. And the doll, when it had become alive and eaten a little food and sipped a little drink, said, "Don't worry, Vasilisa, be comforted. Do as thou didst last night, say thy prayers and go to sleep." So Vasilisa was comforted. She said her prayers and went to sleep, and did not wake until the next morning, when she heard the old witch in the yard whistling. She ran to the window just in time to see Baba Yaga take her place in the big iron mortar, and as she did so, the man dressed all in red, riding on the blood-red horse, leaped over the wall and was gone, just as the sun rose over the wild forest. As it had happened on the first morning, so did it happen now. When Vasilisa looked, she found that the little doll had finished all the tasks except the cooking of the supper. The yard was swept and all in order. The floors were as clean as brand-new wood, and there was not a grain of earth left in the half-measure of poppy seeds. She rested and refreshed herself until the afternoon, when she cooked the supper, and when evening came she laid the table and sat down to wait for the old witch. Soon the man in black on the coal-black horse galloped up to the gate, and the dark fell, and the eyes of the skulls began to shine like day. Then the ground began to quake, and the trees of the forest began to creak, and the dry leaves to rustle, and Baba Yaga came riding in her iron mortar, driving with her pestle, and sweeping away her trail with her broom. When she came in, she smelled around her and went all about the hut, tapping with the pestle. But pry and examine as she might do, again she could see no reason to find fault, and she was angrier than ever. She clapped her hands and shouted, "Ho, my trusty servants, friends of my soul, haste and press the oil out of my poppy seeds." And instantly the 3 pairs of hands appeared, seized the measure of poppy seeds, and carried it away. Presently the old witch sat down to supper, and Vasilisa brought all that she had cooked, enough for 5 grown men, and set it before the witch, and brought beer and honey, and then she herself stood silently watching. Baba Yaga ate and drank everything, every morsel, leaving not so much as a crumb. Then she said snappishly, "Well, why dost thou say nothing, but stand there as if thou wast stupid?" "I spoke not," Vasilisa answered, "because I dared not speak. But if thou wilt allow me, grandmother, I wish to ask thee some questions." "Well," said the old witch, "only remember that every question does not lead to good. If thou knowest overmuch, thou wilt grow old too soon. What wilt thou ask?" "I would ask thee," said Vasilisa, "of the men on horseback. When I came to thy hut, a rider passed me. He was dressed all in white, and he rode a milk-white horse. Who was he?" "That was my white, bright Day," answered Baba Yaga angrily. "He is a servant of mine, but he cannot hurt thee. Ask me more." "Afterwards," said Vasilisa, "a second rider overtook me. He was dressed in red, and the horse he rode was blood red. Who was he?" "That was my servant, the round red sun," answered Baba Yaga, "and he too cannot injure thee." And she ground her teeth. "Ask me more." "A third rider," said Vasilisa, "came galloping up to the gate. He was black, his clothes were black, and the horse was coal black. Who was he?" "That was my servant, the black dark night," answered the old witch furiously, "but he also cannot harm thee. Ask me more." But Vasilisa, remembering what Baba Yaga had said, that not every question led to the good, remained silent. "Ask me more," cried the old witch. "Why dost thou not ask me more? Ask me of the 3 pairs of hands that serve me." But Vasilisa saw how she snarled at her, and she answered, "The 3 questions are enough for me. As thou hast said, grandmother, I would not, through knowing overmuch, become too soon old." "It is well for thee," said Baba Yaga, "that thou didst not ask of them, but only of what thou didst see outside of this hut. Hadst thou asked of them, my servants, the 3 pairs of hands would have seized thee also, as they did the wheat and poppy seeds, to be my food. Now I would ask a question in my turn. How is it that thou hast been able, in such a little time, to do perfectly all the tasks that I gave thee? Tell me." Vasilisa was so frightened to see how the old witch ground her teeth that she almost told her of the little doll, but she bethought herself just in time and answered, "The blessing of my dead mother helps me." Then Baba Yaga sprang up in a fury. "Get thee out of my house at this moment," she shrieked. "I want no one who bears a blessing to cross my threshold. Go, get thee gone." Vasilisa ran to the yard, and behind her she heard the old witch shouting to the locks in the gate. The locks opened, the gate swung wide, and she ran out onto the lawn. Baba Yaga seized from the wall one of the skulls with burning eyes and flung it after her. "There," she howled, "is the fire for thy stepmother's daughters. Take it. That is what they sent thee here for, and may they have joy of it." Vasilisa put the skull on the end of a stick and darted away through the forest, running as fast as she could, finding her path by the skull's glowing eyes, which went out only when morning came. Whether she ran a long way or a short way, and whether the road was smooth or rough, towards evening of the next day, when the eyes in the skull were beginning to glimmer, she came out of the dark wild forest to her stepmother's house. When she came near the gate, she thought, "Surely by this time they will have found some fire," and she threw the skull into the hedge. But it spoke to her and said, "Do not throw me away, beautiful Vasilisa. Bring me to thy stepmother." So, looking at the house and seeing no spark of light in any of the windows, she took up the skull again and carried it with her. Now, since Vasilisa had gone, the stepmother and her two daughters had had neither fire nor light in all the house. When they struck flint and steel, the tinder would not catch, and the fire they brought from the neighbors would go out immediately, as soon as they carried it over the threshold, so that they had been unable to light or warm themselves, or to cook or to eat. Therefore, now, for the first time in her life, Vasilisa found herself welcomed. They opened the door to her, and the merchant's wife was greatly rejoiced to find that the light in the skull did not go out as soon as it was brought inside. "Maybe the witch's fire will stay," she said. And she took the skull into the best room, set it on a candlestick, and called her two daughters. But the eyes of the skull suddenly began to glimmer and to glow like red coals, and wherever the three turned or ran, the eyes followed them, growing larger and brighter, until they flamed like two furnaces, and hotter, until the merchant's wife and her two wicked daughters took fire and were burned to ashes. Only Vasilisa the Beautiful was not touched. In the morning, Vasilisa dug a deep hole in the ground and buried the skull. Then she locked the house and set out for the village, where she went to live with an old woman who was poor and childless. And so she remained for many days, waiting for her father's return from the far distant kingdom. Time soon began to hang heavily on her hands. One day she said to the old woman, "It is dull for me, grandmother, to sit idly hour by hour. My hands want work to do. Go, therefore, and buy me some flax, the best and finest to be found anywhere, and at least I can spin." The old woman hastened and bought some flax of the best sort, and Vasilisa sat down to work. So well did she spin that the thread came out as even and fine as a hair, and presently there was enough to begin to weave. But so fine was the thread that no frame could be found to weave it upon, nor would any weaver undertake to make one. Then Vasilisa went into her closet, took the little doll from her pocket, set food and drink before it, and asked for its help. And after it had eaten a little and drunk a little, the doll became alive and said, Bring me an old frame and an old basket and some hairs from a horse's mane, and I will arrange everything." So Vasilisa hastened to fetch all that the doll had asked for, and when evening came she said her prayers, went to sleep, and in the morning she found ready for her a frame perfectly made to weave her fine thread upon. She wove for 1 month, she wove for 2 months. All the winter Vasilisa sat weaving her fine thread, till the whole piece of linen was done, of a texture so fine that it could be passed like thread through the eye of a needle. When the springtime came, she bleached it so white that no snow could be compared with it. Then she said to the old woman, "Take thou the linen to the market, grandmother, and sell it, and the money shall suffice to pay for my food and lodging." When the old woman had examined the linen, however, she said, "Never will I sell such cloth in the marketplace. No one should wear it except the Tsar, and tomorrow I shall carry it to the palace." The next day, accordingly, the old woman went to the Tsar's splendid palace and fell to walking up and down before the windows. The servants came to ask her what she was doing, but she answered them nothing and kept walking up and down. At length the Tsar opened his window and said, "What dost thou want, old woman, that thou walkest up and down here?" "Oh, Majesty," the old woman answered, "I have with me a marvelous piece of linen, so wondrously woven that I will show it to no one but you." The Tsar bade them bring her before him, and when he saw the linen he was struck with astonishment at its fineness and beauty. "What wilt thou take for it, old woman?" he asked. "It is priceless," she answered, "but I have brought it to thee as a gift." The Tsar could not thank the old woman enough. He took the linen and sent her to her house with many rich presents. Seamstresses were called to make shirts for him out of the cloth, but when it had been cut up, so fine was it that not one of them was skillful enough to sew it. The best seamstresses in all the Tsardom were summoned, but no one dared to undertake the task. So at last the Tsar sent for the old woman and said, "If thou didst know how to spin such thread and weave such linen, thou must also know how to sew me shirts from it." And the old woman answered, "O Tsar, Majesty, it was not I who wove the linen. This is the work of my adopted daughter." "Take it then," the Tsar said, "and bring her to me." The old woman brought the linen home and told Vasilisa the Tsar's command. "Well, I knew that the work would needs be done by my own hands," said Vasilisa, and locking herself in her own room, she began to make the shirts. So fast and well did she work that soon a dozen shirts were ready. Then the old woman carried them to the Tsar, while Vasilisa washed her face, dressed her hair, put on her best gown, and sat down at the window to see what would happen. And presently a servant in the livery of the palace came to the house and said, "The Tsar desires himself to see the clever needlewoman who has made his shirts, and he desires to reward her with his own hands." Vasilisa rose and went at once to the palace, and as soon as the Tsar saw her, he fell in love with her with all his soul. He took her by her white hand and made her sit beside him. "Beautiful maiden," he said, "never will I part from thee, and thou shalt be my wife." So the Tsar and Vasilisa the Beautiful were married, and her father returned from the far distant kingdom, and he and the old woman lived always with her in the splendid palace, in all joy and contentment. As for the little wooden doll, Vasilisa carried it about with her in her pocket all her life long.